All right, hey guys, we're back. So just to kind of wrap up this slide and talking about the Fugitive Slave Act. So again, it was put in there to appease Southerners who wanted something to be done about this over the success of the Underground Railroad, as of course you know, led by Harriet Tubman. We see Northerners starting to get really upset about the Fugitive Slave Act because they felt that they were being forced by this slave power that had control in the federal government, and was essentially overriding the sovereignty of their individual states. So a state like Massachusetts might say that they're against enforcing the Fugitive Slave Act, and the federal government is going to say, no, thank you. You have to do this. And as you saw in the Story of Us on Friday, judges were paid $10 if they convicted someone of being a slave and sent them back into slavery, and only $5 if they set them free. So the economic incentive was certainly there to rule unfairly and unjustly as well. Kind of another thing that's going to come up is the Uncle Tom's Cabin, which is written by Harriet Beecher Stowe, and this is really going to lead many Northerners to start to really question the morality and the political power of the slave South. Okay, so I'm going to turn it back to Mr. Vieira, who's going to kind of walk us through some of these maps.
All right, so here you have a map that is referencing the California Compromise, or the Compromise of 1850. It's called two different things in textbooks, so be prepared. It means the same exact thing. So according to the Compromise of 1850, California out west would become a free state, and a stricter fugitive slave law is passed, which pacifies and kind of makes Southern congressmen and senators agree to the bill, or to the compromise. So here you see a map kind of depicting the Underground Railroad. You can see areas in which, in the South, along the Cotton Belt, with larger slave populations, and then the free and the slave states. An important thing to remember about the Underground Railroad is safety wasn't the North if you were a fugitive slave or a runaway slave. Slavery was Canada. And as a result of...
Freedom was Canada.
Freedom was Canada. What did I say?
Slavery was Canada.
No, just in the winter.
True.
Freedom was Canada. So the goal was to get to Canada, obviously. And so federal judges, like Mr. Eskridge said, were given bonuses if they ruled in favor of the slaveholder against the runaway slave. So I get the luxury of talking about this handsome devil, Stephen Douglas. So the Kansas-Nebraska Territory, which you can see is right here in this area of your map, was set to be added to the United States of America. Now, these territories, which were part of the Louisiana Purchase, were north of 3630. As a result of that, north of 3630 meant that under the old Missouri Compromise agreement, that they would be free territories. Stephen Douglas knew that if that was the case, that the South would never agree to that, and Southerners would never agree to add that territory to the Union. So he proposes a compromise. Stephen Douglas's motivation behind this whole thing is a railroad, which is really relevant, but that's why a senator from Illinois is really getting involved here. So according to the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854 and Stephen Douglas's bill, the anti-slavery line of 3630 would be kind of kaput. And the territory of, I'm going to go to this map because it's kind of easier to explain here. The territory of Nebraska and Kansas would be split in two, and the voters would get to decide through a process known as popular sovereignty whether or not those states would be added to the Union as a free or a slave state. So what that means is in Kansas would hold an election, and in their election, they would either vote for entering the Union as a free state or entering the Union as a slave state. And the whole goal was that under popular sovereignty, the people of the state would get to decide. So you get a little bit more direct democracy. There's a couple of obvious flaws with that. First off, people that are enslaved do not have suffrage, and so didn't have a voice in the whole conversation. It also sets up a battleground in which future states would be politicized in a sense that if you were a slaveholder or if you were a pro-Southerner or if you were an abolitionist, it would be in your best interest to move into those territories so that you could have a voice in the election. And that's what we really begin to see once Kansas is set to join the Union. So the Kansas-Nebraska Act pretty much is the reversal of, in a lot of ways, the California Compromise and the Compromise of 1820. And it sets in motion sort of the battleground of the state of Kansas. I'll go ahead and just stick with this. The Kansas-Nebraska Act creates the Republican Party pretty much. The Republican Party is created as a alternative to the Democratic Party. And after the Kansas-Nebraska Act, there's a clear, the battle lines are clearly drawn. The Democrats are the slave-owning party of the South. The Republicans become the abolitionist party of the North. The first Republican candidate for president, oddly enough, is a Californian. John C. Fremont of California is the first candidate. He loses, but the Republicans kind of view the loss as a successful failure in that they did rather well, actually, considering the fact that they were a new political party. It's also important that in 1856, we get the kind of bursting onto the scene of a pretty important historical figure in American history, Abraham Lincoln. By 1856, Abraham Lincoln is starting to build a name for himself within the Republican Party. He is firmly a supporter of John C. Fremont in his quest to run for president. So one of the first major Republicans and the first Republican president is going to be Abraham Lincoln, and we're going to talk a lot about Lincoln over the next couple of weeks. So I'll kick it back over to Mr. Eskridge.
Okay, so I'm going to talk about Bleeding Kansas. So Bleeding Kansas is kind of the first the first violence that erupts in this evolving crisis for the country over the issue of slavery. And for a long time, the West and these new territory that were gained during this time period from the founding of the nation up until this time had really been kind of like the pressure valve on the country. And the fact that there was more land out to the west, there was more land for expansion for both individuals that wanted a free states and those that wanted slave states. It was out there. There was places to move. Once California entered the scene and became part of the United States, that really obviously there's an ocean to the west of us, and so that's really going to block expansion. So we start to see these things kind of erupt and eventually lead to all-out civil war. So Bleeding Kansas is the first issue of that, or instance of that. And so in Kansas, as part of that Kansas-Nebraska Act, the issue of slavery would be decided by popular sovereignty or decided by the people that inhabit that territory, that what will become a state. And so we have, as Mr. Vieira said, we have people flocking from the north that are anti-slavery, people flocking from the south that are pro-slavery, and they are trying to populate the Kansas territory as much as they possibly can so that when the election as to whether Kansas would be admitted as a free state or a slave state happened, one side or the other would take the vote, would win the day, and would have more representatives. And what eventually happens is Kansas sets up basically two state governments. One's pro-slavery, one's anti-slavery, and there's conflict between there. The majority of people that live in Kansas did, in fact, vote to be admitted as a free state. The federal government refused to accept those votes. And so a gentleman by the name of John Brown, who you see him over here with his dapper beard, he and his sons are really fervent anti-slavery advocates. And what they do is they go and they just murder 5 pro-slavery settlers in very brutal ways. And so this really kind of sets off what will eventually lead to the Civil War. And we're going to see John Brown come on the scene again prior to the Civil War. Okay. So
two things on this slide, because we wrap this up here in a minute. There's 2 signals here. There's the Dred Scott decision, or Scott v. Sanford in 1857. Dred Scott was a slave living in Missouri, or a Missouri slave living in the Northern Territories. His slave master dies. He sues in federal court for his freedom. The Dred Scott decision is important and critical because the Supreme Court rules that slaves cannot sue for their freedom because slaves are not citizens. This is a clear signal to the nation that the federal government has the plan of extending slavery. James Buchanan, probably the worst president we've ever had.